The Last Prince of Eridu, Chapter 1. Born Under a Blood-Red Moon. The city of Eridu, eldest of all cities, lay sweltering under a swollen summer moon. The river Abzu steamed under the weight of the sun's memory. The reeds whispered like restless tongues in the night breeze. The ziggurat of Inanna, towering at the city's heart, caught the strange red light of the moon like an open wound in the sky. Its white stones, polished by centuries of ritual and conquest, now gleamed dark and oily as if some unseen stain seeped from within. Along the broad avenues, the citizens of Eridu had gathered, silent and uncertain. Old women muttered into their shawls. Merchants shuttered their stalls early, murmuring prayers to the seven gods of luck and fortune. Children whimpered in their mothers' arms, their wide eyes reflecting the sickly crimson above. Above them all, in the palace of 100 bronze doors, Queen Inanna cried out in labor. The birthing chamber was thick with the scent of crushed myrrh and blood. The midwives, women old enough to have seen the rise and fall of kings, exchanged anxious glances over the queen's heaving body. Outside, King Eker paced like a chained wolf. He wore no crown tonight, only a simple robe of linen now soaked through with sweat despite the cooling night. The tall, imperious king who had once crushed his enemies with iron had been reduced to a stooped, hollow-eyed man. He muttered as he walked, clutching an amulet of black stone that the court sorcerers had pressed into his palm, a desperate, last-ditch protection against ill omens. The chief midwife, a hawk-nosed woman named Tasmintu, emerged from the chamber at last, bowing low. "My king," she said, voice hoarse from hours of incantation and effort. "It is done." Eker did not move at first. His lips trembled. He feared to ask, but fear was a king's constant companion. "And," he rasped, Tasmintu hesitated, "the child is alive. And my queen?" The old woman closed her eyes for a moment. "She lives. For now." A long breath escaped the king's cracked lips. He staggered into the birthing chamber, past the guards who lowered their eyes in respect. Or pity. Within, Queen Inanna lay pale and exhausted, a sheen of sweat covering her brow. Her once brilliant hair, black as night, now clung damply to her cheeks, yet her eyes, fierce and golden, burned as she cradled the infant to her breast. The boy was silent, not crying, not wailing as a newborn should. He stared up at the world with wide, solemn eyes, the color of molten bronze. And in his tiny, clenched left fist, he gripped something, a shard of stone. No one could say from where. None had placed it in his crib, none had seen it before. It was small and black and shimmered with a strange inner life, as though veins of light pulsed deep within. The king reached out with shaking fingers to touch the boy. The child turned his gaze upon him, and in that instant, King Eker, slayer of kings, builder of empires, felt himself known, stripped bare, judged, and found wanting. He recoiled. Tasmintu, whispering prayers under her breath, lifted the boy gently from the queen's arms. One of the younger midwives, eyes wide with terror, murmured, "He was born clutching stone, a gravestone, a token from the underworld." The old astrologer, Enmerkar, arrived, summoned hastily from the Temple of Stars. He was a bent reed of a man, robed in silver-threaded blue, his head crowned with a circlet of hammered tin. He peered at the infant, muttering calculations under his breath, glancing at the blood-red moon visible through the chamber's high windows. Then he fell to his knees, pressing his forehead to the stone floor. "My king," he croaked, "the child. He is marked by fate beyond the ken of men. He will either raise Eridu to undreamt glory or pull it down into darkness." Eker swallowed, his throat dry as riverbed dust. He looked at the boy again, at the fragment of black stone, at the steady, solemn gaze, and he knew, deep in the crumbling citadel of his heart, that Eridu's fate had already been sealed. He named him Alunu, the unexpected. And outside, the blood moon slid westward, staining the river and the walls and the dreaming streets with its silent, terrible promise. Chapter 2. A Prince Among Shadows. The palace of Eridu was a city unto itself, halls broad enough for chariots to race through, gardens heavy with the scent of lotus and myrrh, pillars carved with the faces of forgotten kings and gods, some smiling, some weeping. Within these walls, Prince Alunu grew, but never as a normal child would. He was neither coddled nor adored. The servants spoke to him with careful words, careful eyes. The guards bowed too low, the nobles smiled too wide, their laughter sharp-edged like broken glass. When he passed through the colonnades, conversation stilled. Women turned their faces aside, whispering prayers under their breath. Old warriors gripped the hilts of their swords as if an unseen enemy walked at his side. Alunu learned early that he was a blade, beautiful to look at, deadly to touch. His days were filled with the lessons demanded of a prince. Swordsmanship with General Dagon in the courtyard under the blazing sun, cuneiform writing with scribe Anumarduk in dusty chambers filled with scrolls, statecraft and diplomacy at the knee of Queen Ninita, who had survived childbirth but never truly recovered. Yet even in these lessons there was a distance, a wariness. When Alunu sparred with the other young nobles, they fought too carefully. When he wrote his lessons, the scribes whispered over the shapes he formed, the way the glyphs twisted subtly, as though guided by another hand. When he spoke at court, the counselors nodded and smiled, but their eyes betrayed fear. He often escaped these suffocating attentions by wandering the older parts of the palace, where the stones still whispered of forgotten things. There, in crumbling gardens overtaken by vines, he spoke to voices no one else could hear. One afternoon, as the sun bled low and golden across the river, Alunu sat beneath an ancient tamarisk tree whose roots cracked the very marble of the courtyard. He traced lines in the dust with a stick, half lost in thought. Drawing again, came a voice. He looked up to see Lilitu, the old washerwoman, her basket of linens balanced effortlessly on one hip. Her face was lined and weathered by countless seasons, but her eyes were sharp. Too sharp, perhaps, gleaming like dark gemstones. "What do you see in your dust pictures, little prince?" she asked, lowering herself to sit beside him. Alunu hesitated. He had learned caution, had learned that sharing his dreams brought only frowns or cold smiles. But Lilitu had never feared him, not once. He dragged his stick again, carving a rough spiral that folded in upon itself. "I see a river," he said slowly, "but it does not run with water. It runs with stars. And it drowns everything, the trees, the towers, the people. It drinks the world." Lilitu smiled faintly, as if pleased. "A fine river, then. The world is thirsty." He frowned. "Do you think I'm wrong? Strange?" At this she laughed, a rich, belly-deep laugh that startled a flock of doves from the nearby fig trees. "Oh, child," she said, wiping her eyes, "strangeness is the seed of greatness. The question is, will you root it in soil or stone?" Before he could answer, a shadow fell over them both. It was General Dagon, tall, broad, his beard meticulously oiled, his eyes like chips of flint. "My prince," Dagon said, voice thick with false deference, "the king requests your presence." Alunu rose, dusting off his hands. He cast one last look at Lilitu, but she was already moving away, lost among the linen and the shadows. In the council chamber, he found King Iker seated upon his throne of black cedar and bronze, a robe of white wrapped around his wasting frame. The king's eyes, once so keen, now wandered as if seeing things only he could perceive. At his side stood High Priestess Ninlil, clothed in midnight blue, her long fingers trailing beads of lapis lazuli. The air smelled of spiced wine and the burnt offerings of incense. Yet, underneath it all was the sour tang of sickness. Alunu bowed low. "My father." The king gestured vaguely, and Ninlil took the signal to speak. "We have had troubling reports," she said, her voice smooth as riverstone. "There are omens, signs in the river, in the fields, in the heavens." Eker coughed, a wet, rattling sound, then spoke. "They say you are a curse, boy." The words fell like stones into the still chamber. Alunu stood straight. "I have done nothing. You were born," Iker whispered, a strange terror flickering across his face. The high priestess knelt gracefully at the king's side, murmuring comfort. Then she turned her eyes, cold and sharp, upon Alunu. "There are ways, my prince," she said, "to appease the gods, ways to cleanse ill fortune." Alunu's stomach twisted. He knew enough of temple lore to guess at her meaning. The scapegoat rite, where the sins of a city were laid upon a single soul, then banished or slain. The culling of the blood, where royal kin were sacrificed to renew the land. "Are you suggesting," he said carefully, "that my blood will heal Eridu?" Ninlil only smiled, a small, secret smile. Eker stared into nothingness. Alunu bowed once more, feeling the black stone in his pocket grow suddenly, strangely cold. As he turned to leave, the priestess called softly, Remember, my prince, the gods are always watching, and they are swift to judge. That night, as the palace lamps guttered and the jackals howled beyond the river, Alunu dreamt. He dreamt of a black river running through Eridu, swallowing its towers, its priests, its kings, and standing atop the ziggurat crowned with fire, he saw himself. But his face was wrong, shifting, empty. He woke with a gasp, and he knew, deep in his bones, that something was coming. Something terrible. Something inevitable. Chapter 3. The Shattering Dream. The night was heavy with silence when Alunu awoke. The sounds of the palace were muffled, distant, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. The air was thick and oppressive, as if the very stones were holding back a tide of darkness just beyond the horizon. Alunu lay in his bed, wide awake, his heart racing. His mind still buzzed with the fragments of a terrible vision, one so vivid, so real, that it felt as if the gods themselves had stepped into his dreams. Scores. He had stood at the top of the ziggurat once more, but this time the sky above him was not the soft purple of dusk. No, it was a sickly green, as though the heavens had been poisoned. Below, the city of Eridu was drowning. The great marble towers that had once stood proud and unyielding were now sinking, swallowed whole by a black, churning sea. The river had turned to pitch, its waters thick with the bodies of the fallen. In the midst of the destruction stood a man, but this man had no face, only a swirling darkness where his features should have been. He was crowned, yes, but not with gold or jewels. His crown was wrought from twisted horns, black and slick, like the twisted roots of an ancient tree. The faceless man raised his hand, and in that moment Alunu felt a burning heat in his chest. His skin seemed to crawl as though something had sunk into him, something alive, ancient, and hungry. The faceless man spoke, but his voice was not a voice. It was a terrible whisper, like the sound of the earth itself groaning under the weight of its own age. You are the last seed of a dying world, little prince. Choose, rule a broken realm with blood and iron, or wander beyond the stars, forgotten but free. Alunu sat up in his bed, drenched in sweat. The chamber was cold, yet he could still feel the warmth of the dream's phantom touch against his skin. His fingers clenched around the shard of black stone that he had carried with him since his birth, the same stone that had seemed to call to him in his waking hours. Was it a dream or a warning? He swung his legs over the edge of the bed, the chill of the stone floor biting at his bare feet. The palace was silent. Outside his window, the night had deepened, and the moon, though not blood-red this time, hung large and full, watching, waiting. He needed to understand. There had to be more. There had to be an answer, but there was no one to ask. No one could guide him through this. As if summoned by his thoughts, there was a soft knock at the door. "Enter," Alunu called, though he did not know why he spoke. A part of him had known who would come. The door creaked open, and standing in the shadows of the doorway was Lilitu, her silhouette bathed in the dim light of the moon. She held no basket, no linens. Her eyes were hard, sharp, as though she had known the weight of his dream before he even had the chance to speak of it. "Are you awake, my prince?" she asked softly, her voice carrying the weight of long-hidden truths. Alunu nodded, though the word yes felt inadequate for what he was feeling. His mind was a tangle of confusion and dread. "Come in," he said. Lilitu stepped into the room, the soft rustle of her rags the only sound that filled the silence between them. Her eyes flicked briefly to the shard of stone in his hand, but she said nothing about it. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, Alunu could stand it no longer. "What is happening to me?" His voice was low, raw, as if the question itself had been strangled in his throat for far too long. "Why do I see these things, these dreams? What is this stone?" He held it up in his hand, his fingers trembling ever so slightly. Lilitu closed her eyes, and for the first time in all the years he had known her, there was nothing of humor in her face. She looked tired, weary, beyond anything he could fathom. She spoke slowly, carefully, as though choosing each word with the weight of centuries behind it. "You have always been more than you know, my prince. The blood in your veins is not merely that of kings. It is the blood of something older, something that existed long before Eridu rose from the sands. Alunu's breath caught in his throat. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "No, that cannot be true. I am the son of Ekur and Ninita, the heir to this throne." Lilitu's smile was bitter, sharp. The gods have never been so simple. They do not choose their vessels for the strength of their blood alone. No, Alunu. The powers within you are both a gift and a curse. Your birth was no accident. It was planned. He recoiled. Planned? Lilitu nodded, the darkness in her eyes deepening as she spoke. There are those who watch from the shadows, those who weave the threads of fate long before they reach the light of the sun. They were the ones who made your birth possible. They chose your mother and father as much as they chose you. Alunu's heart pounded in his chest, his mind whirling with a storm of questions he didn't know how to ask. Who are they? He demanded, rising to his feet. His voice was almost frantic now, as though he could force the truth out of her by sheer will alone. Lilitu's gaze softened, but it was the softness of something resigned to the inevitable. They are the ones who have always ruled the world from the shadows, Alunu. The elder gods, the beings who shaped this world long before humans ever walked it. Alunu's legs felt weak. He staggered back toward the bed, collapsing into the cold sheets, his mind spinning from the weight of Lilitu's words, finally settled on the last thing she had said. The elder gods. She nodded, her voice low and haunted. They are not gods, Alunu, not in the way you believe. They are something older, more terrible, and they will not allow your world to live much longer. Alunu's breath caught in his chest as he felt the weight of her words settle over him like a cloak. The truth had always been there, beneath the surface, but now it was undeniable. For the first time in his life, he felt the full weight of the world pressing down upon him, and that was when he heard it. A whisper, faint, like the rustling of 1,000 dry leaves. But there was no wind, only the voices. In the darkness of the room, the shadows began to move. Not the normal shadows cast by moonlight, but something deeper, something darker. Lilitu stepped back, her eyes wide with recognition. No, not now, she whispered, her voice trembling. They're coming for you, Alunu. The time has come. You must leave. Alunu stood, his heart racing. What do you mean? Who's coming for me? Who? But Lilitu didn't answer. Instead, she reached into her robes and pulled out a small worn map, ancient and fragile, its edges curling like old parchment. She handed it to him, her hands trembling as though afraid to let go. Follow this. It will lead you out of the city and into the wilderness, but you must go now, before it's too late. Alunu took the map from her, his fingers brushing against hers. He saw her fear, raw, unmasked, and it frightened him more than anything he had ever felt in his life. Why? He asked, his voice shaking. Why are they coming for me? Lilitu's face tightened, and for the first time he saw something like regret in her eyes. Because they know what you are, and they fear what you could become. Alunu swallowed hard, looking at the map. It was a map of the desert, the wilderness, a world beyond the walls of Eridu, but the edges of the map blurred and shifted, as though the land itself was alive, changing shape. He looked back at her. What do I do? Lilitu stepped forward, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. You do what you were born to do. Chapter 4, The Exile's Path. The night was not kind to Alunu. When he took the map from Lilitu, he didn't look back. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat louder than the last, as if it too were warning him. The shadows in his room had grown deeper, more suffocating, and the whispers, those strange whispers that had plagued his dreams, seemed to grow louder, more insistent. Run, Prince. The words were almost imperceptible, as if they were carried on the wind, yet they reached him clearly. His fingers tightened around the map, his mind running wild with a dozen thoughts at once. He had never left the palace before. Eridu had been his world, the great city at the heart of everything, the place where the rivers converged and the gods were closest. Now it was a cage, its walls closing in on him, its people whispering of his fate. But none of that mattered anymore. Alunu stepped into the dark hallway, his footsteps muffled on the cool stone. The halls were empty, eerily so. The servants, the guards, the courtiers, none were in sight. It was as though the entire palace had fallen into a deep slumber. He moved with purpose, yet every shadow seemed to stretch toward him. The whispers followed him, now unmistakable, a language ancient and cold, something far older than anything the human mind could comprehend. He turned a corner and froze. In the distance, he could make out the glimmer of torchlight flickering in the corridor. A patrol of guards. The very last thing he needed. The soft tread of their sandals echoed off the stone, and Alunu's heart clenched. If they saw him, it would be over. The map would be useless. He pressed himself against the wall, holding his breath. He could feel the heat rising in his chest, a pulse that almost seemed to hum with the same rhythm as the whispers. The guards passed, their voices low and muffled, unaware of the prince just beyond the shadows. Alunu exhaled quietly, sweat beading on his forehead. He could not afford to be discovered. The palace had eyes everywhere. There were spies among the servants, the nobles, even among the family. The moment he was found, he would be trapped. With careful steps, he moved past the guards and toward the back of the palace, where the secret tunnels lay. These tunnels had been built long ago, during the time of the first kings, and they led out into the wilderness beyond the city. But something was wrong. As he neared the entrance to the tunnels, Alunu felt a chill crawl up his spine. The very air seemed to shift, heavy and oppressive, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting. And then he heard it. A sound like the scrape of iron on stone, a low and terrible screech. Alunu froze. From the corner of his eye, he saw something move, dark and fluid, like ink spilling across the floor. It was a shadow, but it wasn't just a shadow. The shape that emerged was wrong. It was a creature, long and sinuous, with eyes that glowed with an unnatural greenish light. It was a demon, something old and twisted, a thing that had not been seen by the eyes of men for thousands of years. The shadow demon slithered closer, its eyes fixed on him, its form distorting with each movement. Alunu's heart skipped a beat. It was as though it had been waiting for him. Before he could react, a voice cut through the tension. "Run, Alunu." It was Lelitu's voice, distant, but clear. Without thinking, Alunu bolted. His feet flew over the stone floor as the demon hissed behind him, its screeching growing louder with each step. He could feel the cold air on his skin, the weight of the creature's presence pressing down on him. He didn't dare look back. The tunnels were close now. He could almost taste freedom. But then, as he reached the entrance, something cold and heavy seized his ankle, pulling him off balance. Alunu stumbled, hitting the ground hard. The demon's claws scraped along his leg, burning through the fabric of his tunic and drawing blood. He cried out, his body tensing in pain, but somehow he wrenched himself free. He rolled forward, slipping into the dark tunnel just as the demon's screech echoed in his ears. The moment he was inside, the world shifted. The air became thicker, denser, not with earth but with something ancient. The walls of the tunnel seemed to breathe as though they were alive, hungry. The next few days were a blur. The tunnels twisted beneath the earth, winding and narrow, their walls slick with moisture. Alunu barely noticed the passage of time. He only knew the cold and the dark, the gnawing hunger that gnawed at his insides, and the ever-present whispering that seemed to come from all sides. By the third night, he found himself in an unfamiliar part of the tunnel, one that seemed to pulse with a strange, sickly energy. It was then that he saw her again. Lelitu. She stood before him, her face illuminated by the faint light that glimmered from the crystal veins that ran through the tunnel walls. She didn't speak at first, but the look in her eyes was enough to tell him that something was wrong. Something had shifted. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her voice low and ragged. "I don't understand," Alunu said, his throat dry, voice tight with exhaustion. "What's happening? The demon, the shadow." "Not a demon," Lelitu said quickly. "Not what you think." She reached out, gripping his arm tightly, her fingers cool against his skin. "It's a creature of the elder gods, Alunu, a servant of those who watch from the dark corners of this world." "What does it want from me?" "You are their prize child. You were born to be both the vessel and the key." Alunu recoiled. "A key? A vessel? What are you talking about?" Lelitu's eyes were pained, as though this truth was a burden she had carried for far too long. "They want you, Alunu. They want you for what you can unlock. A door to something greater than Eridu, greater than this world. A power beyond imagining." The map in Alunu's hands seemed to grow heavier. He could feel the weight of its secrets pulling at him, almost as though it was alive, like it could lead him to the very heart of that power Lilitu spoke of. Alunu closed his eyes, trying to focus. The world outside the tunnel was still the world of men, with all its lies, fears, and desperations. But here, deep below the earth, he was no longer just the Prince of Eridu. Here, he was something else, something far older, far darker. "I can't go back," he muttered. "Can I?" Lilitu's face softened, her eyes filled with a sorrow Alunu could not place. "No, you can't, but you're not alone, Alunu. You never have been." Chapter 5: The Wilds Beyond Eridu in Kruglo. The air was different here. The stale, stagnant air of the tunnels had given way to the crisp, fresh scent of the wilderness. For the first time since his escape, Alunu felt something akin to freedom, yet it was tempered by the gnawing knowledge that he could never return to his old life. The map Lilitu had given him burned in his hand, its edges curling as though it too was alive, guided by forces he couldn't comprehend. The tunnels had eventually opened into a vast, desolate desert, stretching far into the distance. The sun was a harsh overseer, unforgiving and relentless, its rays searing the earth beneath his feet. But there was something wrong about the desert. It wasn't just the emptiness, the way the sand stretched for miles without so much as a single tree or hill to break the monotony. It wasn't even the strange whispers that seemed to echo from the dunes themselves, though that too made his heart race with anxiety. No, it was the stillness. Alunu had never seen a desert so silent. There were no birds, no animals, not even the usual rustling of the wind. The only sound was his own breath, harsh and ragged as he stumbled onward, desperate to find some kind of shelter or guidance. He glanced down at the map again. The inked lines were shifting, blurring beneath his fingers. The land was changing, just as Lilitu had said it would. He could feel it in his bones. The world itself was changing, and that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was the feeling he wasn't alone. For 3 days, Alunu wandered through the desert, the heat gnawing at his skin, the thirst biting into his throat. There were moments when he thought he heard footsteps behind him, slow, deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. But when he turned, there was nothing, only the endless stretch of sand, the dunes shifting like the ocean's waves. On the 4th day, he came to a clearing, a strange, natural place where the sand had turned to stone. The ground was littered with ancient ruins, remnants of a civilization long forgotten. Massive pillars that had once supported some grand temple now lay in ruins, their stone faces weathered by time and neglect. Faint markings, almost faded beyond recognition, covered the stone surfaces. Alunu approached the ruins cautiously, his senses on high alert. He could feel the presence again, that invisible force that had followed him from the palace, from the tunnels. And then, from the shadows of the crumbling stone, a figure emerged. The figure was cloaked in a long, tattered robe, its face obscured by a hood. The wind seemed to stir around the figure, swirling the sand in strange patterns that defied nature. For a moment, neither spoke. The figure simply stood there, its hands clasped at its sides, watching Alunu with an intensity that made the prince's skin crawl. Finally, the figure spoke, its voice soft but terribly cold, as if it were carried from the depths of the earth. "You have come, Prince Alunu." Alunu's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know this figure, and yet the way it spoke, it knew him. It knew exactly who he was. "Who are you?" Alunu demanded, though his voice was shaky. He couldn't hide the fear in his voice, not now. The desert had drained him, and this figure was something he couldn't quite understand. The figure tilted its head, as though amused by his question. "I am called Marduk," it replied. "But names are meaningless, especially here, in this place." Alunu took a step back, his fingers instinctively clutching the map, which still burned in his hand. "What is this place, and why are you here?" Marduk's gaze flickered briefly to the map, and for a moment, Alunu thought he saw a shadow of something ancient and powerful flicker in the figure's eyes. "This is the Valley of Echoes, a place forgotten by time. Here, in this forgotten corner of the world, the forces that shaped your destiny have come to rest, and I am here because you are no longer safe." Alunu's pulse quickened. "Safe? From what? From who?" Marduk took a step closer, his robes rustling like the wind through dry leaves. He did not answer immediately, but instead his hands lifted slowly, revealing his palms. On each palm, strange symbols were etched, symbols that seemed to shift and pulse with a life of their own, as though the very air around him was charged with ancient magic. "The elder gods are not pleased that you are here," Marduk said, his voice almost a whisper now. "They know you have escaped, and they will not allow such a thing to go unpunished." Alunu's breath caught in his throat. He took a step back, the weight of Marduk's words pressing down on him like a heavy stone. "Why? What do they want from me?" The figure's lips curled into a thin smile, and it was not a comforting smile. It was cold, distant, as though the figure was far removed from any mortal emotion. "They want you because you are their key, a key to unlock the power that lies beyond the gates of this world. You were born to this purpose, Alunu. The gods have made sure of it." I can't notice. The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Alunu could barely breathe as he tried to understand what Marduk was telling him. The vision from his dreams, the cryptic words, all of it was beginning to make sense, but it made no sense at the same time. "Then why are you helping me?" Alunu demanded. "If you serve the elder gods, why warn me?" Marduk's expression darkened. "I do not serve them, Prince. I serve something greater." Alunu's confusion deepened. "What do you mean?" Before Marduk could answer, the ground beneath them shuddered. The air seemed to warp and twist, and the sky darkened as if a great shadow had fallen over the land. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, their voices rising in a terrifying chorus. Marduk's expression hardened. "They have found us." From the depths of the riss, the moment the words left his mouth, the earth seemed to split open, the desert floor cracking as if a great chasm were opening to swallow them whole. From the depths of the rift, dark shapes emerged, moving like shadows made solid, creatures with long, gnarled limbs, their eyes glowing with an eerie light. "The Watchers," Marduk whispered, his voice full of dread. "They come for you, Alunu. We cannot hide from them any longer." Alunu's heart raced. He could feel the air crackling with the power of the creatures, their presence like a weight that threatened to crush him. The world was closing in on him, and the only thing he could do was run. He turned to Marduk. "What do I do? Where do I go?" The figure's eyes glinted with something dangerous, and then, without another word, he pointed to the dark rift in the ground. "Go, Prince. Go into the depths of the valley. You will find what you need there." Alunu didn't hesitate. With one last glance at the approaching Watchers, he sprinted toward the rift, the darkness swallowing him whole. Chapter 6. The Trials of the Valley. The rift closed behind him with a violent tremor, the earth cracking and sealing shut as though the very land itself had swallowed him whole. Alunu was left in a vast chasm, its walls soaring upward like jagged teeth, cutting the sky into thin, oppressive strips of light. The valley was bathed in a sickly green hue, and the air was thick with an eerie stillness, as though the very breath of the world had been held in anticipation. For a long moment he stood there, breath coming in ragged gasps. His skin tingled with an unnatural chill, and his thoughts raced. The creatures Marduk had called the Watchers were still out there, somewhere, their presence lingering like a storm on the horizon. But here, in the Valley of Echoes, they were nothing compared to the forces he would have to face. Alunu could feel it now. The weight of destiny pressing down on him with unbearable force. He had always been a prince, a child of Eridu, but here he was something far greater. And that, perhaps, was the most terrifying part of all. The valley stretched before him, its terrain shifting in unsettling ways. The landscape itself seemed to breathe. The stone beneath his feet was alive, shifting and pulsing as though the earth itself was watching him. A sudden gust of wind, dry and unnatural, swept through the valley, carrying with it the faint sound of a voice. A whisper, so faint it could have been a trick of the mind, yet unmistakable. It beckoned him forward. "Come, Alunu, the trials await." He clenched his fists, steeling himself. He had come this far. He could not turn back now, became softer. The first trial came almost immediately. As he walked deeper into the valley, the air grew thicker, and the ground beneath his feet became softer, like sand, but heavy, gripping his boots as if trying to pull him under. His pulse quickened. This was no ordinary place. The Valley of Echoes was alive with ancient magic, and he was its prey. Without warning, the ground split apart ahead of him. Alunu barely had time to react before shadowy figures emerged from the rift. They were humanoid, but their limbs were too long, their features twisted and grotesque, their bodies swathed in shadow. One of the creatures stepped forward, its glowing eyes narrowing as it sized up the prince. It spoke, its voice a low growl that reverberated in Alunu's chest. "You must pass through the rift of suffering, Alunu. Fail, and you will become like us, a lost soul in the depths of the earth." The words sent a jolt of fear through him, but he refused to show it. He had been prepared for this moment. He had to be. "What is the rift of suffering?" Alunu asked, his voice steady despite the fear that churned in his stomach. The creature did not answer directly, but instead raised a hand toward the rift. The air seemed to shimmer and distort, and Alunu felt a cold, suffocating presence close in on him. The rift pulsed, opening like an eye, a vast, swirling void of darkness, a gate into the very core of despair itself. The creature's voice became a hiss. "This is the rift of suffering, the first of the trials. To pass, you must enter the void and face your greatest fears. Only then will you be worthy to continue." Alunu stared at the swirling void, his heart hammering in his chest. He knew what was expected of him. He had to face what he had been running from for so long. But was he truly ready? Was he ready to confront the darkness within himself? With a deep breath, Alunu stepped forward, his feet dragging as he crossed the threshold into the darkness. There was no sound here, no lichens. The world around him shifted the moment he entered the rift. The oppressive weight of the valley lifted, replaced by an overwhelming sense of isolation. There was no sound here, no light, only the suffocating silence of endless night. For a long time, Alunu stood disoriented, the darkness pressing in on all sides. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and the very ground beneath his feet seemed to ripple like water. His own heartbeat echoed in his ears, unnervingly loud in the silence. And then, slowly, the darkness began to change. At first, it was subtle, a shadow at the corner of his vision, a flicker in the corner of his mind, but soon it took shape. The shadows coalesced, forming figures, distorted and shifting, like reflections in broken glass. Alunu blinked, and his surroundings began to shift as though the world itself were collapsing in on him. The shadows grew more distinct, and the air grew colder. He recognized them. The figures were faces he knew, distorted beyond recognition. His father, King Iskander, stood before him, but the man was not the king he remembered. This version of his father was cold, his eyes hard as stone, his face twisted in anger. "You are weak, Alunu, weak like your mother. You will never be fit to rule." Alunu's breath caught in his throat. It felt real. The anger, the disappointment in his father's voice. It was as if the king's soul had been resurrected just to torment him. His father's face contorted with hatred, his voice rising, accusing. "You are nothing but a puppet, Alunu, a pawn in a game you cannot even begin to understand." Alunu's hands trembled, his knees threatening to give out beneath him. He had faced his father's disapproval for years, but this was different. This was a manifestation of his own deepest insecurities. But he couldn't give in. Not now. "No, I am not a pawn. I will be more than what you wanted me to be. I will rise above this." The shadows of his father's face flickered, and the king was gone, replaced by another figure, Lilitu, the woman who had once been his confidant, his guide. "You are alone, Alunu. You always have been." The words stung. He wanted to deny them, but the truth in her voice was undeniable. Hadn't he always felt that way? The weight of the crown, the expectations, the constant pressure, all of it had been a prison. But the shadows twisted again, and Lilitu's form began to fade, leaving only a haunting whisper in the air. "You will never escape yourself." Alunu gritted his teeth, fighting the urge to scream, to flee. He knew this was just a trial. He had to face it. He had to confront these fears head-on, or he would never escape the rift. The darkness began to recede, but only slightly. More visions appeared, each more twisted than the last. They were his fears, his doubts, made flesh, and one by one he fought back. "You are more than your fears." He whispered the words to himself, each breath a declaration of defiance. "I will not be a prisoner of my past." Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the darkness shattered. The rift closed behind him, and Alunu found himself standing once again in the Valley of Echoes. The creatures of shadow had vanished, but the weight of what he had just faced lingered. He had passed the first trial, but it had not come without cost. His mind was rattled, his body weary, and his soul scarred by the visions he had seen. But he had survived. The voice from earlier spoke again, its tone now less menacing and more approving. You have passed the first trial, Alunu, but there are more to come. The path ahead is not an easy one, but you have shown your strength. Alunu wiped the sweat from his brow, his mind still spinning from the darkness he had just encountered. He had faced his worst fears, but now there was no turning back. He was deeper into the Valley of Echoes than ever before, and the trials would only grow harder from here. And deep in the distance, Alunu could hear the whispers once more. The Watchers were coming, and with them, the truth of his destiny would soon be revealed. Chapter 7: The Trial of Reflection. The air in the Valley of Echoes was still thick with the remnants of Alunu's first trial. He could still hear the faint, lingering whispers of his fears, now muffled like echoes bouncing off the walls of his mind. His body was weary, his muscles aching from the strain of the mental and physical exertion. But he couldn't rest, not yet. There was more to this journey, more trials ahead that he had to endure if he ever hoped to unlock the truth of his existence. The path ahead was obscured by a dense mist, a seething fog that twisted in the air, swirling in eerie patterns as though it had a mind of its own. The mist was alive, it seemed, drawing close like a curtain drawn across the world, consuming everything in its path. Alunu could barely see the ground beneath his feet. He took a step forward, the soft crunch of his boots muffled by the fog. The deeper he walked into the mist, the more disorienting the world became. Shapes seemed to form in the periphery of his vision, only to disappear the moment he turned his head. The air smelled of damp stone and something far more unsettling, the scent of memory. And then, just as the fog closed in around him completely, a figure emerged. At first, it was only a shadow, flickering in the distance, growing clearer with each passing second. Alunu squinted, his heartbeat accelerating. He could feel it, the presence of something profound, something ancient standing before him. As the figure came into focus, Alunu's breath caught in his throat. It was him, or at least a version of him. The figure before him was a perfect reflection, but it was not the prince he recognized. This version of himself was different, older, more regal, and radiating an energy that Alunu could not quite understand. There was an almost otherworldly glow surrounding the reflection, and the air itself seemed to hum with its presence. The figure smiled at him, a knowing, almost mocking expression that sent a shiver down Alunu's spine. You have come far, Prince Alunu, but are you truly ready to face what you are? Alunu took a cautious step back. This was not just a reflection, this was him, but not him. It was as if he was standing in the presence of some other version of himself, one that had been shaped by a different life, a different fate. His heart raced as the reality of the trial began to sink in. Who are you? Alunu demanded, his voice shaking despite his efforts to sound strong. The figure did not answer immediately. Instead, it took a step forward, its eyes gleaming with a mysterious knowledge. I am what you will become, or rather, what you could have become, had you chosen a different path. Alunu's mind raced. He couldn't understand. This wasn't possible. Was it? I don't understand, he said, his voice growing desperate. You are not me. You can't be. The figure chuckled softly, a low sound that reverberated in the fog. And yet we are one and the same. You stand before your own potential, Alunu. Alunu took a step forward, his gaze locked on the figure before him. His eyes searched for some sign of weakness, some hint that this was an illusion, but there was nothing. The reflection stood there, calm, unyielding. What is this trial? Alunu asked again, his voice steadier this time, despite the confusion swirling in his mind. This is the trial of reflection, the figure replied, its voice laced with both sorrow and amusement. Here, you must face the choices you could have made, the person you might have become, and the path you are yet to choose. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Alunu's mind began to unravel as the true nature of the trial became clear. This was not about facing enemies, nor surviving the physical dangers of the valley. This was about confronting the truth of himself, his potential, and the deep-seated questions about who he really was and what he was meant to be. The trial begins. The reflection before him shimmered, and with a sudden movement, the scene around Alunu shifted. He found himself standing in a grand palace, not the one he had known, but a palace that was different, larger, more magnificent, filled with opulence beyond anything he had ever seen. The walls were adorned with tapestries of golden dragons and intricate designs of stars. The air was heavy with the scent of incense, and a low murmur of voices filled the hall, speaking in a language that was strange to him. At the far end of the hall stood the figure again, the reflection of himself, now dressed in rich robes, wearing a crown that gleamed with an otherworldly light. The expression on his face was one of absolute authority, the kind Alunu had never felt within himself. This is what you could have become, Prince Alunu, a ruler above all, untouchable, powerful. The reflection's voice was soft but carried a weight of inevitability. Alunu's heart pounded as he moved forward, his feet carrying him across the polished stone floor. He felt out of place in this grand vision of a future he had never chosen, yet somehow it felt so familiar, as if it was something he had always wanted. Look at yourself. The reflection's voice echoed in the hall. You were born for this, to rule, to command. Not just a kingdom, but an empire that stretches beyond the borders of Eridu, a force that cannot be stopped. But at what cost? Alunu froze. He could feel something stirring inside him, ambition, a desire for power. The words struck a chord within him, stirring memories of the palace back home, the politics, the control, the way his father had often spoken of his destiny. Could he have walked this path? Could this vision be his? But then something else happened. The vision flickered. The grandeur of the palace began to twist and distort, the walls cracking and crumbling. The tapestries faded, turning to dust. The voices in the hall grew louder, their words now angry, accusing. The reflection of Alunu turned toward him, its smile now hollow, its eyes filled with something darker. Is this what you wanted, Alunu? To be a ruler with no soul? A king in name only, with nothing left but power? The hall collapsed around him, and in its place, Alunu found himself back in the valley, standing alone in the swirling fog. The reflection had disappeared, but the weight of its words lingered in the air, suffocating him. Alunu fell to his knees, his head spinning. The trial had shattered him. He had come here seeking answers, but all he had found were more questions. The person he had seen, the ruler in the vision, was not someone else. It was him. It could be him. A future that lay within his reach, if he chose it. But at what cost? His breath came in heavy gasps as the fog swirled around him once more. The path ahead was unclear, but the reflection's words haunted him. You must decide, Alunu. Who will you be? The trial was not over. It had only just begun. Chapter 8. The Trial of Shadows. The mist of the Valley of Echoes hung thick in the air, oppressive and choking. Alunu's heart still raced from the previous trial, his mind unable to fully grasp what he had seen. The reflection of himself, that future king, that shadow of ambition, had haunted his every step, questioning his choices, his future. But now he stood at a crossroads, alone. The fog around him began to shift. Shapes twisted within the white haze, vague outlines that seemed to lurk just beyond his vision. Alunu instinctively clenched his fists, readying himself for whatever came next. He was no longer the unsure, frightened prince who had stepped into this valley. The weight of the trials had sharpened him, his resolve solidifying like steel in a furnace. But the shadows, they felt different. A sound broke the silence, a low, drawn-out moan that echoed off the walls of the valley, distorting and stretching like the wind itself was weeping. Alunu stepped forward, his steps muffled by the thick fog, the noise growing louder with each step he took. And then they appeared. From the fog emerged figures, tall, dark shapes with glowing red eyes, their forms shifting like smoke, flickering in and out of existence. Their movements were erratic, as though they were made of shadow, but also something else. Something alive, pulsing, breathing. The first of the figures reached out a hand, its fingers long and twisted like those of a creature that had not known warmth for eons. The air around Alunu grew colder, the chill seeping into his bones. "Welcome, Prince Alunu." The voice was a raspy whisper, the sound of it scraping against his mind like nails on stone. "You've come far, but now you will face the darkness within you, the shadows you've tried to bury." The words sent a shock through Alunu's chest. He knew these creatures were not just watchers, nor were they merely the manifestations of the valley's magic. They were something deeper, something more personal, the shadows of his own psyche. They had come to remind him of the parts of himself he feared to confront. The shadows close in. Alunu took a step back, his breath shallow. The creatures were drawing nearer, their forms flickering as they circled him. Their eyes glowed with malice, their presence suffocating. He could feel their weight pressing in on him, as though the very air were turning to stone, heavy and unyielding. "You think you can defeat us?" One of the shadows hissed, its voice dripping with contempt. "You think you can escape the darkness inside you?" Alunu swallowed hard, but he refused to show fear. "I've already faced my fears. I will not back down." The shadows seemed to recoil, and as though his words had struck a chord. But then the creatures began to laugh, a low, echoing sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating in Alunu's ears, making his head spin. "Fears?" Another shadow rasped, its form growing larger. "You misunderstand, Prince. We are not just your fears. We are the choices you have made, and the ones you have yet to make." The ground beneath him shifted again. The fog swirled violently, and suddenly Alunu was standing not in the mist, but in the palace once again, the one from his previous trial. This time, however, it was not the grand, shining palace of his ambition. It was darker, corrupted. The walls were cracked and crumbling, the chandeliers hanging like broken, jagged teeth. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the distant murmur of voices had turned into screams. Alunu's eyes widened as he took in the scene. It was a vision of a future. Yes, but one tainted by his own choices. Choices he had made in pursuit of power, and the inevitable consequences that followed. He could hear the faint sound of battle, clashing swords, the cries of soldiers falling. The reflection of the future king stood in the center of the hall, but this time it was not regal. It was twisted, a dark shadow of what he could have been. "You did this, Alunu. You chose this path." The voice was familiar, but it was not his own. It was Lilitu's, distorted and full of anger. "You couldn't see the cost of ambition. Now your kingdom is falling apart." Alunu felt his heart drop in his chest. The vision was not just about power. It was about the sacrifice that came with it. The people, the lives, the very soul of the kingdom he had been entrusted to protect. "You let your ambition blind you. Now you will watch it all burn." The voice of Lilitu echoed around him. The ground beneath his feet cracked open, and from the gaping wound in the earth, monstrous forms began to emerge, creatures born of shadow, born of the consequences of his actions. They were twisted versions of those he loved, their eyes filled with rage and betrayal. They reached out to him, their hands clawing at his flesh, trying to drag him into the pit. "You failed them, Alunu. You failed us." Alunu felt his resolve falter for the first time. This was not just a trial. This was his truth. The dark reflection of the choices he had made, the consequences of his actions, and the terrifying possibility of what he might become if he was not careful. The shadows closed in around him, their twisted forms whispering his worst fears, of failure, of betrayal, and of becoming the very monster he had tried to escape. But just as he thought he might succumb to the weight of it all, something shifted within him. He had faced his past, his fears, and now he had to face himself. He drew a deep breath, steadying his mind, his resolve hardening once more. "I am not you." Alunu's voice rang out, strong and clear. "I am not the prince you wish me to be. I will not allow fear or shadows to dictate my fate. I choose my path. I choose the light." The shadows recoiled, screeching in agony as if his words had burned them. They writhed, twisting and contorting, unable to withstand the strength of his will. "You are not me." One of the shadows spat, its form dissolving into mist. "But we will see if you can truly escape us." With a final, anguished wail, the shadows faded, leaving Alunu standing in the empty, decaying hall. The weight on his chest lifted, but the silence that followed was not peaceful. It was a silence filled with questions of what he had just faced and of what lay ahead. The valley stretched out before him, still and silent. The fog lifted, and in its place stood an empty landscape, barren and desolate. Alunu's breath came in heavy, uneven gasps as he wiped the sweat from his brow. He had faced his darkest impulses, his self-doubt, and the consequences of his choices. But the trial was far from over. He had survived, but there was more to come. The voice of the valley echoed once more, this time softer, almost sympathetic. You have passed the trial of shadows, Alunu, but do not forget, the darkness is never truly gone. It waits, hidden, ready to return. The path ahead remained unclear, but Alunu's resolve was stronger than ever. He was no longer just a prince. He was something more, something that would forge his own destiny, no matter the cost. Chapter 9, The Trial of the Heart. The fog that surrounded Alunu began to thin, but the valley was far from peaceful. He stood at the edge of a vast chasm, the ground beneath him cracked and uneven, stretching out to the abyss below. The valley was now a place of stark contrasts, a wilderness of desolation, yet it held a deep, eerie beauty. The towering cliffs rose on either side, jagged and sharp, as though the very earth had been split apart by some great force. Alunu's heart beat in his chest, a rhythmic drum that echoed the tension in his mind. The shadows of the past had not left him, but he had faced them head-on. The trial of reflection had shown him the path he could have walked, and the trial of shadows had made him confront the darkness within. But this next trial, this would be different. It would not be about fear or self-doubt. It would be about something far more elusive. Ahead of him stood a figure, silhouetted against the harsh light of the setting sun. The figure was tall, draped in flowing robes that fluttered in the wind, but it was not the robes or the appearance that caught his attention. It was the presence, the heavy, unmistakable presence of someone he had known, someone who had once been a vital part of his life. It was Leora, his sister, his blood, the reunion. Leora stood at the precipice, gazing out at the landscape as though lost in thought. Her features were soft, but there was a hardness to her expression, a solemn weight that Alunu had never seen before. As he approached, the wind picked up, swirling around them both in a silent dance. Leora, Alunu called, his voice barely above a whisper. At the sound of his voice, she turned, her gaze locking onto him with a piercing intensity that made his heart skip a beat. For a moment, there was no recognition, just a strange, almost alien quality to her expression, as though she were someone else entirely. But then, her eyes softened, a flicker of something familiar crossing her face. "Alunu," she said, her voice calm but heavy, "I knew you would come." Alunu's chest tightened. He took another step forward, but the distance between them seemed vast, as though some invisible force was keeping them apart. "I've come to find the truth," he said. "Leora, what is this place? Why are you here?" Leora's lips curved into a half smile, but it did not reach her eyes. She raised her hand, gesturing to the chasm that stretched out before them. "This is the trial of the heart." Her voice was softer now, tinged with sadness. "Here you must confront what lies at the center of your soul, Alunu. The heart is where our deepest desires and fears reside, but it is also where our love is kept, our greatest source of strength." Alunu's brow furrowed in confusion. "But why are you here?" Leora's smile faltered, and she looked away for a moment. "Because, Alunu, I am the heart of this trial. I am the one who stands between you and the truth you seek. And what's more, I am the reflection of your greatest fear." Alunu stepped back, the words seeping into his mind like poison. His greatest fear? The idea of confronting his sister, someone so close to him, felt both surreal and painfully real. He could feel his emotions beginning to churn within him. Was she truly here? Or was this another test, a manipulation of his feelings? "I don't understand." His voice broke slightly, his hands trembling at his sides. Leora sighed, her gaze softening as she turned back toward him. "You never understood, Alunu. You were always the prince, the one destined for greatness. But I was always the one who loved you unconditionally. And now, this trial is a choice you must make. You can either choose your ambition or choose your love." The words pierced him like a dagger. His heart ached. He had always thought that his ambition would lead him to greatness, that the weight of his destiny as heir to the throne was the only thing that mattered. He had chosen that path time and time again, ignoring those around him. But here, in the stillness of the valley, surrounded by memories of the past, the truth began to emerge with painful clarity. "What do you want from me, Leora?" Alunu whispered, his voice cracking. The figure of Leora stepped closer, and as she did, her form seemed to shimmer, her features becoming more and more distorted, as though she were a living manifestation of his regrets. Her face flickered between the sister he had once known and something darker, more haunting. "You know what I want," Leora whispered, her voice now thick with the sorrow of ages. "You abandoned me, Alunu. You abandoned everyone you ever cared about. And now you must choose. Will you continue your pursuit of power, or will you finally allow love to guide you?" The chasm before him seemed to grow wider, deeper, as if it was swallowing him whole. His thoughts were tangled, and his emotions felt like a storm inside him, pulling him in every direction. Was it too late to turn back? Had he already crossed the point of no return? "You are the Prince of Eridu," Leora continued, her voice now taking on a cold edge. "But in all the years I've known you, Alunu, I've never seen you as the prince. I've seen you as my brother, the one who walked beside me as we grew up together. And I've seen how you've sacrificed all of us for that dream. You must decide, Alunu. Choose who you will be, the ruler or the brother." The choice. A silence stretched between them, long and agonizing. Alunu closed his eyes, his mind flooded with memories, the childhood games they had shared, their laughter in the palace courtyard, the bond they had once shared. But there were also the bitter moments of separation, when his ambition had driven him away from her, when his eyes were turned toward the throne and not his family. The weight of his choices pressed heavily on his shoulders, threatening to crush him. The images of his father's expectations lingered in the back of his mind. The throne had always been his destiny, but at what cost? He thought of the sacrifice Leora had made for him. She had given everything for him. Her love, her care, her devotion. She had been the one constant in his life, even as he had distanced himself. But was it too late to go back? Leora's voice again broke through his thoughts, but this time it was not filled with anger or sorrow. It was soft, filled with longing and a gentle plea. "Alunu, come back to me. Come back to us." Alunu stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest, and with each step he felt the weight of his decisions. His father's voice, the one that had pushed him toward greatness, now seemed distant. The love he had for his sister, his family, was clearer than ever before. He held out his hand toward her, a tremor in his voice. "I choose love, Leora. I choose you." As he spoke those words, the air around them shifted, the chasm fading away as if the very fabric of the valley was responding to his declaration. The image of Leora before him softened, her features returning to their familiar warmth. Her smile was radiant, filled with love and forgiveness. "Thank you, Alunu." And with those words, the valley's fog lifted completely, revealing a new path, the path that Alunu had finally chosen. His journey was far from over, but he had taken a crucial step forward. The trial of the heart was complete. Chapter 10. The Trial of the Soul. The landscape before him had shifted again, transforming into something both breathtaking and foreboding. The fog had dissipated entirely, replaced by a vast open expanse that stretched to the horizon. Alunu stood at the edge of a great chasm, a jagged, deep ravine that seemed to separate him from whatever lay beyond. There was no bridge, no path forward, only an unyielding abyss. But it wasn't the chasm itself that struck him. It was the sky. The sky above him was not the soft blue he had known. Instead, it was dark, as if the very essence of night had taken over, filled with swirling clouds of purple and crimson. Strange constellations moved across the sky in unnatural patterns, forming shapes that were both familiar and unsettling, shifting like the echoes of dreams and nightmares alike. Alunu felt the pull of the chasm beneath his feet, an inexplicable gravitational force, as though the very fabric of reality was warping. His heart began to race again. This place was different. This trial would not be like the others. A voice, ancient and all-knowing, echoed from the depths of the ravine, vibrating in the very marrow of his bones. Alunu, you have traveled far, but this trial will not test your strength or your heart. It will test something far deeper, your soul. He looked around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing but the eerie silence and the crackling tension in the air. The soul is the core of your being, the place where your true essence resides, the place where your identity is formed. The voice continued, its tone heavy and filled with an ancient sorrow. It is the very foundation of your future, the wellspring of your power, and the shadow that will follow you forever. Alunu swallowed, a deep chill crawling up his spine. What do you mean by that? He called out into the void. The voice answered, but this time it came from within his mind, like a whisper threading through his consciousness. You are not the man you once were. Every choice, every trial you have faced has changed you. But now you must confront what those changes have made you. You must face your soul. The descent. The ground trembled beneath Alunu's feet, and as if responding to the voice, the chasm before him began to widen, revealing a path that led downward into the heart of the earth. The air grew thick with the scent of something ancient, of lost time and forgotten memories. The path beckoned, dark and narrow, but it was the only way forward. Without hesitation, Alunu stepped toward the chasm, the edge of the abyss, swallowing the light as he descended. His steps echoed in the stillness, and with each downward movement, the air seemed to grow heavier. The further he descended, the more the pressure built. His heart beat harder, and a deep emptiness crept into his chest. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the path opened up into a vast underground cavern. The air here was thick with magic, a palpable energy that seemed to hum in the stone itself. The cavern walls shimmered with an iridescent glow, reflecting the faint light of an unseen source. In the center of the cavern was a stone altar, its surface smooth and untouched, though it radiated a strange energy. At the base of the altar stood a figure. It was himself. The vision of Alunu stood before the altar, but this figure was different. His face was hollow, eyes dark and devoid of emotion, his skin pale and lifeless. The figure was not the confident prince he had become. It was the version of himself that had been lost to the darkness, the prince who had sacrificed everything for the throne. It was the reflection of his soul. The air around him pulsed with energy as the figure slowly turned toward him. Its lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile devoid of warmth, a smile filled with an unsettling emptiness. So, you've come to face me at last. The figure's voice was not his own. It was hollow, distant, like the echo of someone lost to time. You've chosen love over power, brother over crown, but do you truly know who you are now? Alunu stepped back, a knot tightening in his chest. You are me, aren't you? The figure nodded slowly, its face expressionless. I am the reflection of everything you have buried, every choice you've made, every path you've taken. I am the part of you that is lost, the part of you that still longs for power, for control. The words sliced through him like a blade. His mind began to race. This was his soul laid bare before him, every fear, every doubt that had ever lingered within him. This figure was not an enemy. It was not a beast to be slain. It was himself. Alunu stepped forward, his voice trembling. I don't understand. I've chosen love. I've chosen my family. I've given up my ambition. Why are you still here? The figure's hollow gaze met his, and for the first time, it spoke with a voice that held a deep, familiar pain. Because you cannot escape who you are, Alunu. It stepped closer, the words tinged with sorrow. You can choose love, but you cannot erase the hunger for power that lives within you. The throne is in your blood. The shadow of that ambition will follow you wherever you go. It is a part of you, whether you like it or not. Alunu staggered back, his heart pounding painfully in his chest. The truth of the figure's words hit him harder than anything he had faced so far. The shadows of his ambition, the desire to rule, to make his mark on the world, could not be easily cast aside. It was entwined with his very being, and no matter how hard he tried to choose a different path, it would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface. You cannot hide from yourself, the figure continued, its voice cold and final. Your soul is fractured, Alunu, and until you reconcile these parts of yourself, you will never be whole. The confrontation. Alunu's mind reeled as he struggled to process the enormity of what the figure had said. His soul fractured, his choices irreparable. For a brief moment, the abyss of his own darkness seemed to engulf him, pulling him into a place where hope seemed impossible. But then, something inside him stirred. The love he had chosen, the family he had decided to protect, these were the things that had brought him here. They had guided him through the trials, giving him the strength to face his own weaknesses. They had shown him that he was not defined by his failures, but by his ability to choose, to evolve. No longer would he allow this twisted reflection to define him. Alunu stepped forward again, his voice firm this time. I accept who I am. His words echoed through the cavern, ringing with an unmistakable strength. I will not hide from my past. I will not deny my choices. I may be flawed, but that does not mean I am lost. I will make my own destiny. The figure before him seemed to waver, its form flickering like a fading shadow. A blinding light began to radiate from the stone altar, engulfing both Alunu and the figure. The cavern began to crumble, the walls shaking violently as if the very earth could no longer contain the force of their confrontation. The reflection of Alunu faded, dissolving into the light until nothing was left but the hum of power that filled the air. Alunu stood alone, the cavern now empty. The weight in his chest had lifted, replaced by a deep sense of clarity. He understood now. The true strength did not lie in avoiding his flaws, but in embracing them. To be whole, to be truly free, was to accept both light and darkness within himself. The trial of the soul was complete. Chapter 11. The Final Trial. Alunu stood in the aftermath of the trial of the soul, his body tingling with the remnants of energy that pulsed through the cavern walls. The echoes of his soul's confrontation faded slowly, replaced by a profound silence, a silence that felt heavy with expectation. The path ahead, dark and uncertain, stretched out before him. The Valley of Echoes was no longer the place of illusions or fragmented memories. It had become a place of truth. He stepped forward, his every movement careful yet purposeful, as though each footfall were a choice in itself. Behind him, the cavern began to collapse in on itself, the walls crumbling away, but Alunu didn't look back. The trials were over. The last piece of himself had been revealed, and now the final trial awaited. A vision appeared in the distance, a faint glimmer of light, warm and inviting, contrasting sharply with the barren landscape around him. The path seemed to lead toward it, and his instincts told him this was no ordinary light. This was the culmination of everything he had worked toward. His journey had led him to this point, and though he did not know what awaited, he knew he had to face it. He walked steadily toward the light, the wind picking up as he moved, whistling softly through the rocks. The air was charged with an energy that seemed almost alive, and the ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse with the same rhythm as his heart. The arrival at the gates. After what felt like hours, Alunu arrived at the threshold of the gates. The gates themselves were towering structures of smooth obsidian stone, inscribed with ancient symbols that seemed to shimmer and shift with every passing second. The light he had followed was no longer just a beacon, it was emanating from the gates themselves. There was something both awe-inspiring and terrifying about the sight before him. Atop the gates stood two massive statues, their faces etched with an expression of eternal judgment. Their eyes glowed faintly, and the air around them seemed to hum with unspoken power. The gates themselves were immovable, but Alunu knew this was not just a physical barrier. It was something far more profound. A voice, familiar yet distant, rang out from the gates, vibrating through the very air around him. It was a voice he recognized, but it was not the voice of a single person. It was the collective echo of all his trials, all his fears, and all his hopes. Alunu, you've come far, but the final test awaits you. The words resonated deeply within him, as if they were speaking directly to the core of his being. The voice continued, its tone both somber and final. You must face the truth of your future. You will either claim the destiny that awaits you, or you will turn away and live the life of a shadow. Alunu felt the weight of the words press upon him, and for a brief moment, doubt began to creep into his heart. What was his destiny? What had he truly been chosen for? Was he the prince destined to rule over Eridu? Or was he simply a man caught in the swirling tide of forces beyond his control? The gates remained silent, their presence a challenge. Alunu stepped forward, his heart pounding, and with a voice that was stronger than any he had spoken before, he addressed the gates. "I am ready." And with that, the gates began to shudder, the obsidian stones grinding against each other with a sound like thunder. The statues atop the gates seemed to come alive, their eyes glowing brighter, their expressions shifting from judgment to something else, something that could only be described as recognition. The gates opened with a slow, deliberate motion, revealing what lay beyond. The vision of Eridu. Beyond the gates, Alunu was met with a vision, an image of Eridu, his homeland, laid out before him in its most glorious form. The city rose from the heart of the desert, its walls shining with gold, its towers reaching toward the heavens. The markets were alive with vibrant colors and sounds, the people joyful and free. It was a vision of prosperity, of unity, of a kingdom that had flourished under the rule of a wise and just king. And in the center of the vision stood Alunu himself, not as the young prince he had been, but as a ruler, a king, strong and resolute. The people cheered his name. The land prospered under his leadership, and everything he had dreamed of was coming to life before his eyes. But the image shifted. Slowly, imperceptibly, it began to twist. The golden walls began to crack, the towers crumbling. The market stalls emptied, the people's faces turned somber and distant. The once bright city of Eridu was fading, becoming a desolate, lifeless wasteland. The cries of the people were no longer joyous, but filled with anguish and despair. And at the heart of this ruin, Alunu saw himself again, but this time he was not the ruler he had envisioned. He was a shadow, his crown tarnished, his face twisted in sorrow. He stood alone, the weight of his choices crushing him. The choice. Alunu fell to his knees as the vision of Eridu faded before him. The light from the gates flickered and dimmed, and a deep silence overtook the air. The images of the future, both glorious and ruinous, had passed, leaving only one undeniable truth. The future was not set in stone. The destiny of Eridu, the course of his life, was not decided by some force beyond his control. It was his choice. Alunu stood again, the weight of the choice now more apparent than ever. He knew that he had already made the decision in his heart, to choose love, to choose family, to choose humanity over the cold ambition that had once consumed him. But now, the final test was to manifest that choice. It was not enough to claim love. He must be willing to sacrifice for it, to put the good of his people and his kingdom above his personal desires. He had seen the future of Eridu, both its shining potential and its tragic decay. And it was clear now that only by embracing his true self, by being the ruler that both loved and protected his people, could he save his homeland from the abyss. With newfound clarity, Alunu stepped toward the heart of the gates, his resolve unshakable. His voice rang out with the certainty of one who had finally found his purpose. "I choose my people. I choose the kingdom. I will be the ruler they deserve." The gates erupted in a brilliant burst of light, enveloping Alunu in an overwhelming wave of power. The ground trembled beneath him, and the sky above seemed to split open, revealing the vastness of the cosmos. But through the light, Alunu felt only peace, a profound sense of alignment between his heart, his soul, and his destiny. And then, as quickly as it had come, the light faded. Before him stood a path, clear, unobstructed, and bright. The gates had opened fully, and the way forward was now laid out before him. He stepped forward, his heart beating with purpose, his mind clear. The final trial was over. Chapter 12. The Return of the King. The journey had come full circle. Alunu stood on the precipice of the Valley of Echoes, gazing toward the horizon where the sunlight slowly began to touch the world, as if the earth itself were welcoming him back. He had faced his trials. He had chosen the path of love, of humanity, of sacrifice. He had confronted his darkness and come out of the depths of his own soul stronger, wiser, and more resolute than ever. But the ultimate test awaited him, his return to Eridu, his kingdom, his people. The road ahead was no longer unknown. It was clear, though fraught with challenges. The weight of his newfound responsibility pressed heavily on his chest. As he walked away from the gates of the Valley of Echoes, a soft breeze stirred the air, carrying with it the scent of the desert, his homeland, waiting for him. The journey home. As Alanu traveled, memories of his past, the uncertainty of his youth, the hunger for power that had once consumed him, drifted in and out of his mind like the shifting sands of the desert. He had been a prince in name only, uncertain of his purpose, driven by ambition. But now the path he walked was different. It was a path defined by love, by choice, by a deep sense of duty to his people and to the land that had raised him. He did not walk alone. Beside him, Adhira, his friend, his companion, moved with him. Her presence had been a constant throughout his trials, her strength a source of solace and clarity. She had always believed in him, even when he could not believe in himself. In a world that had often seemed full of shadows and hidden dangers, she had been the light that guided him forward. But there was more to their bond now. It had been tested by fire, by pain, by sacrifice, and through it all, they had become more than friends. They had become partners in a journey that would reshape the future of their kingdom. "We are close now," Adhira said softly, glancing out toward the horizon. Her eyes, always steady and filled with an inner strength, were filled with something new now, a quiet hope. Alunu nodded, but his thoughts were troubled. "I have seen the future of Eridu. I have seen the path my kingdom can take. But the choice is mine to make, Adhira, and I must lead them in the right direction. I cannot fail them." Adhira placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him. "You will not fail. You have already chosen." But Alunu knew that the road ahead would be far more difficult than any of the trials he had faced in the valley. Rulership was a burden that could not be taken lightly, and while he had learned much about the weight of love, of family, he knew that the sacrifices required of a ruler went beyond even those. And Eridu, with its people and its rich history, would demand everything from him. The gates of Eridu. After days of travel, the landscape before them began to shift. The once barren desert became alive with the movement of life, scattered oasis gardens, clusters of trees, the distant hum of the city's life on the horizon. They were nearing Eridu, the city that had once been a dream to Alunu, a distant symbol of what he could become. But now, as he drew closer, the city seemed distant in a new way, strange and foreign, its walls towering with the weight of expectation. At last, the gates of Eridu came into view. The great stone walls, once gleaming under the sun, now seemed imposing, as though the city was watching him, waiting for his return. The roads were bustling with the sounds of market life, but there was an air of unease, of something turbulent just beneath the surface. He could sense it, feel it in the very streets themselves. Alunu's heart beat faster as they approached the gates, and he knew that his destiny would not unfold in the same way it had in the vision. There would be no easy path forward. There would be no simple solution to the problems Eridu faced. The decay he had seen in his vision was already there, simmering beneath the surface. It was in the tensions of the people, the factions that fought for power in his absence. At the gates, a group of his most loyal soldiers stood guard, their eyes wary as they spotted him. When they recognized their prince, a murmur spread through them, and slowly they parted, allowing him to pass. The throne room. The throne room of Eridu was as magnificent as it had always been, a massive hall of polished marble with towering columns that rose to the heavens. The air was cool, filled with the faint scent of incense that seemed to swirl lazily in the golden light. The throne, a massive chair of onyx and silver, gleamed at the far end of the hall. But there was something different now. The room that had once felt like a sanctuary of power now felt like a place of judgment. Alunu walked forward, his every step echoing in the stillness. There was a presence in the room. King Tarhan, his father, seated on the throne, the man who had once ruled Eridu with strength and ambition, who had carved his place in history. Yet Alunu knew that he was not the same man he had once been. The throne had corrupted him, just as the weight of power had the potential to corrupt anyone. Alunu. The king's voice was deep and gravelly, though there was a note of weariness in it now, something that hadn't been there before. "You have returned." His father's eyes scanned him with a mixture of pride and wariness. But Alunu knew there was something more. The king's gaze lingered on him for a long moment, and in that silence, Alunu understood the truth. Tarhin was no longer the ruler he had once been. The man who had ruled with an iron fist was now broken, his soul fractured by the weight of his choices. Alunu stepped forward, standing tall, his voice firm and steady. "I have come to claim my place as the ruler of Eridu." Tarhin's eyes darkened. "Have you, now?" There was something in his father's tone, something ominous. Alunu's pulse quickened, and he could feel the tension in the room grow heavier. His father's distant gaze was matched by the whispers of the courtiers who stood in the shadows of the throne room, watching the interaction. They were waiting. "You think you're ready, don't you?" Tarhin's voice was colder now, cutting through the air like a blade. "You think you've learned the lessons you need to rule this kingdom, but you are mistaken. The throne is not about love, Alunu. It is about power, and you will learn, as I have, that once you take the throne, you are bound by it." Alunu stood firm. "No, I've learned that the throne is not a symbol of power. It is a responsibility to protect the people, to lead them with wisdom and heart, not with the iron fist you once wielded." His father's expression hardened. "Then you are a fool." The betrayal. In that moment, as Alunu stood before his father, ready to claim the mantle of leadership, the truth of his father's bitterness hit him like a physical blow. Tarhin had ruled with fear and tyranny, and now that his power was slipping away, he could not relinquish it. There was something darker in his eyes now, a desire to maintain control, even if it meant betraying everything his kingdom needed. Before Alunu could respond, one of the courtiers stepped forward, Varric, a man who had once been a trusted advisor to the king, but Alunu could see the gleam of ambition in his eyes. He knew, without a doubt, that this was a man who would stop at nothing to keep his grip on power. Varric raised his hand, signaling to the guards. In an instant, they surrounded Alunu, their swords drawn, their faces hard. "What is this?" Alunu demanded, his voice growing louder with each word. "Are you betraying me too?" Tarhin's voice rang out with cold finality. "No, Alunu. You are not the king. Not yet, and you will never be as long as I am alive." Alunu's heart pounded in his chest, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him, but he knew one thing for sure: he would not let his father's shadow define him. The time for talk was over. The time for action had come. Chapter 13. The Crown of Shadows. The betrayal stung like a fresh wound, one that Alunu had never anticipated, yet felt inevitable. As the guards circled him, their cold eyes filled with a mixture of duty and calculation, his heart sank. King Tarhin, his father, had just revealed the true depth of his obsession with power. He would rather see Eridu fall into ruin than surrender the throne to his son. Alunu's mind raced, his hand instinctively reaching toward the hilt of his sword. But the guards were too quick, too numerous. His movements were shackled by the realization that his father's influence was vast, far more than he had imagined. Varric, the courtier turned schemer, stood at the side with a smug expression, his arms folded as he watched the scene unfold. "You think you can take my kingdom?" Tarhin's voice was laced with venom, his eyes sharp with hatred. "You are nothing but a child, Alunu. You will never be ready for this throne." Alunu took a deep breath, gathering his thoughts. This was no longer a confrontation for the throne alone. This was a battle for his soul, for the future of Eridu. The weight of his father's words seemed to settle like a stone upon his chest, but beneath that weight, a fire began to burn brighter than ever. "You have lost your way, father." His voice rang out, steady and unwavering. "I will not fight for power. I will fight for my people, and that is something you will never understand." The tension in the room crackled as the guards took another step forward, their swords raised in silent command. But Alunu stood firm, his eyes locked with those of Varric. There was a glint in the man's gaze that made Alunu's blood run cold. He could sense the danger that Varric posed. This was no simple betrayal. Varric had been playing a long game, working behind the scenes to manipulate the forces that would destroy Eridu's future. "You've made a grave mistake, my prince," Varric sneered, stepping forward from the shadows. "Your father's time is over, but the kingdom is mine to claim. The throne will be mine, and your naive ideals will not save you. A chill ran through Alunu's veins as Varric's words hung in the air. The courtier had always been clever, too clever by half, and his ambitions stretched far beyond the walls of this throne room. This was more than a personal vendetta. This was an opportunity for Varric to seize the throne for himself. And he had prepared for this moment for years, using the king's weakness against him, cultivating factions in the court, and waiting for the right moment to strike. Alunu's gaze flickered to his father. The once mighty ruler of Eridu now seemed like a shadow of the man he had once admired. Tarhen had lost his will to lead, consumed by the very power he sought to hold on to. He was no longer a king in spirit, just a man clinging to the remnants of a crown he did not deserve. The moment had arrived. With a swift motion, Alunu drew his sword, the blade humming through the air with a deadly precision. The guards took a step back, surprised by the prince's sudden movement. But Alunu's focus was not on them. It was on his father and the traitor who now stood before him. "No more games," Alunu said, his voice low but filled with resolve. "I will not let you drag this kingdom into darkness." Varric's eyes narrowed, and he made a signal. The guards surged forward, but Alunu was faster. He pivoted, spinning to meet the first guard with a swift slice that sent the man to the floor, unconscious but alive. The remaining guards hesitated, unsure whether to attack or retreat. Alunu's presence in the room, his fury and determination, was palpable. He was not the same prince who had once sought power for its own sake. He was the prince who had learned the harsh truths of leadership and was now willing to do whatever it took to protect Eridu. As the last guard fell, Alunu's eyes returned to his father. Tarhen was sitting unmoving on the throne, his face a mixture of anger and defeat. "Father," Alunu said, his voice a soft echo of the past. "It's over. You've lost. The kingdom is slipping through your fingers. Can you not see that?" Tarhen's eyes darkened with a flash of rage. "You dare lecture me, Alunu? You would defy your own blood for the sake of your people? You are a fool, and I will make sure you pay the price for your defiance." Before Alunu could respond, the throne room doors swung open with a deafening crash, and a new presence entered the room. The sorcerer, Zephyr, a figure draped in a cloak of shifting shadows. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, his steps silent as he walked toward the throne. "So this is the end of the line for the great King Tarhen," Zephyr's voice echoed through the chamber, a low, almost hypnotic tone that carried a strange power. "The time has come to end your reign, my king." Tarhen's face twisted in anger as he looked at the sorcerer. "Zephyr, you have been manipulating the court, haven't you? You have worked with Varric this entire time." Zephyr's lips curled into a smile. "You are more astute than I gave you credit for, King Tarhen. But it is too late now. The kingdom is already mine." Alunu's heart raced. Zephyr was a force unlike any he had ever encountered. The sorcerer's power was dark, corrupting, and he could feel the weight of it pressing against his chest like a crushing wave. This was not just a matter of usurping the throne. Zephyr was a force of nature, a being who thrived in the shadows and thrived on the fear of those around him. His power was tied to the very fabric of the kingdom's turmoil, feeding off the unrest and the uncertainty that plagued Eridu. "You will not have Eridu, Zephyr." Alunu's voice was steady, though a part of him trembled with the knowledge that he was standing before something ancient, something unforgiving. Zephyr tilted his head, his smile widening. "Ah, but I already have it, Prince Alunu. The throne is already mine. You should learn the nature of power before you think you can challenge it." With a flick of his wrist, the air in the throne room seemed to warp, bending and twisting. Alunu's vision blurred, and for a brief moment, he felt as though the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel. A storm was rising in the throne room, and Alunu knew he was at the eye of it. The Battle of Shadows. The battle between Alunu and Zephyr erupted with a violence unlike anything Alunu had ever faced. The sorcerer's dark powers swirled around him like a cloud of smoke, each tendril of shadow reaching for Alunu, pulling at him, trying to consume him. Alunu, though, remained steady, his grip on his sword firm. He had faced his own darkness. He would not succumb to this one. With a cry, he lunged forward, swinging his sword toward the sorcerer, but Zephyr's shadowy magic lashed out to deflect the blow. The blade struck the sorcerer's dark aura with a clang, but it could not pierce through the veil of darkness. "You are weak, Alunu," Zephyr sneered, his voice laced with contempt. "You do not understand the true nature of power. You have no idea what you are up against." Alunu's heart raced, but he refused to be overwhelmed. His mind flashed back to the trials he had faced, the trials of the soul, the moments of clarity and vision. He had learned that true power was not about wielding force, but about balance, about using what was within to challenge the forces that sought to control him. In that moment, Alunu closed his eyes, centering himself, focusing not on the external battle, but on the battle within. The shadows that surrounded him were not just Zephyr's. They were the shadows of his own fears, his own doubts, his own uncertainties. The sorcerer was a manifestation of the darkness he had fought to overcome, and in that realization, Alunu found his strength. With a roar, he pushed forward, his sword glowing with a brilliant light as it cut through the darkness. The sorcerer staggered back, a howl of fury escaping his lips as his shadows began to dissipate. "No, this is impossible," Zephyr screamed. But it was too late. The light of Alunu's blade burned through the sorcerer's darkness, shattering it, and with a final desperate cry, Zephyr collapsed, his power unraveling like smoke in the wind. The kingdom's fate. The throne room fell into an eerie silence. The darkness had lifted, and with it the immediate threat was over. But the damage had been done. King Tarhan sat motionless on his throne, his eyes hollow. Varric had already fled, seeking refuge in the shadows where his ambition could no longer reach him. Alunu stood alone in the center of the room, the weight of the battle still hanging in the air. He was exhausted, his body weary from the fight, but there was a new light in his heart, a light that had grown stronger with each trial, each betrayal, each sacrifice. The throne was no longer just a seat of power, it was a symbol of the responsibility he had chosen. Alunu turned to face his father. "It is over, father. Eridu belongs to its people now. It is time for a new era." But as he looked at the broken king, Alunu knew that the battle for Eridu's future was far from over. This was just the beginning.